Tony Moss, pastor Long Branch Covenant Church, and we're here again. I'm here again with Dr. Ray Ciervo, and this is No Pat Answers Live, where we just talk to you about the kind of things that will help you provide answers for your faith to the people that you talk to. And we've been talking about a number of different things. And last week we talked about the idea that there's so many different aspects of discussion when it comes to issues of faith, and I asked Ray to boil it down to a few main or central ideas that if we could master, that it would help us effectively communicate our faith. And Ray came up with the three things of truth, God, and the resurrection. We talked a little bit about each of those last week, and this week what we want to do is talk about truth. Just the whole time we're going to look at truth and reality, and I guess it's going to be somewhat of a philosophical discussion.
Yeah, you can't talk about truth without being philosophical. So.
Okay, well, I'm not a philosopher, but you have some training in that. So
a little bit.
So I thought a great first question, Ray, is talk a little bit to us about the nature of truth.
Sure, and I think the reason why we include truth in this is because it is just so fundamental to any kind of conversation. Mm-hmm. Like if you don't depend on truth, why would you read anything? Mm-hmm. Why would you ever listen to somebody? Why would you ever ask anybody for directions or something like that if you don't believe that truth exists? Mm-hmm. And yet we live in a world that, especially since I think the 1960s, we have a really different understanding or a different view of truth. So I go, and I mentioned this last week, we go by what we'd call the classical view of truth, which is the correspondence theory of truth, which means that a claim about, any truth claim has to correspond to what's real. Mm-hmm. So truth has to match the facts. It has to, it tells it like it is. It's a very simple definition of it, is that we believe that there is something real out there, real right here, mm-hmm. and that a truth claim basically has to correspond to that reality. Okay.
So how would you compare that? You said the 60s, that things have started to change. What would you say that people would say, or the popular theories of truth that are in our society, in our culture today?
Right. Well, I think if you're ever out sharing the gospel or even talking with friends, you'll hear things like you can't know the truth, or some will even go as far to say that there's no such thing as truth. Or that something, I guess the popular one is that something can be true for you but not for me, or that's your truth. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad that works for you. I'm glad that that's true for you, but definitely is not, true for me.
And I always think of gravity when I think of that.
Yeah.
Gravity tends to be true for everyone.
And fire.
Yeah,
fire is true for everybody
true for
too.
everyone. That's good.
When you put a match on somebody, you ask them if
that is true. I think everyone would agree with that. So this kind of thinking that is now popular today, where did it originate? We talked a little about that before we started today, where that kind of thinking originated.
Yeah, well, if we go back, I think that, I mentioned that there's high points in, let's call it the history of thought, rather than just say in the philosophical world. And I'm sure, I'm an amateur when it comes to philosophy. I've studied philosophy and understand some things about it. But there are high points through the whole history of thought, say starting with the medieval period, mm-hmm. where I believe they had a very good grasp of reality and a grasp of the essentials that were based even further back to the Greeks. Mm-hmm. So from that point, you come to the Enlightenment, what's called the Enlightenment. And by the way, it's the Enlightenment people who called the medieval period the Dark Ages.
That's correct, yes.
So they're like the enlightened ones, and everybody else is living in the Dark Ages. But Immanuel Kant would be someone that we would look at who would have said that you can't know reality as it is. You can only know it as it appears to you. So now, truth about reality doesn't become knowable.
Okay.
I can only know something as it affects me. So that's how you get to true for me, but not for you. And he basically was going off of something that he encountered with David Hume. And David Hume was an empiricist, and he believed that everything had to originate in your senses.
Okay, empirical truth. We can
Empirical
touch
truth.
it,
You have
feel
to,
it,
exactly.
measure it.
Your five senses have to apprehend it, and everything starts there. And Hume was an idealist in that sense, but let me back up a step. David Hume was a skeptic. He didn't believe that anything that didn't originate in your five senses could be known. I've got a quote here that he says, if we take in our hands any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and delusion. So that's a statement that he's basically saying that if it isn't empirical, then throw it in the fire. Mm-hmm. It's talking above your head, and it's really nonsensical, so you can't do anything with it. So anything that has to do with God, because we understand that God isn't apprehended in our five senses, mm-hmm. So anything of divinity is just worthless. So that was skepticism, basically saying that you had to be skeptical about anything that wasn't taken in by your five senses. So Hume lays that down, and then Kant comes along, and he says he was changed by Hume's, he was awakened by Hume's understanding of things. But he moved it to what we call agnosticism, that you really can't know it. And in philosophy, they call it a Kantian gulf, that there's a gulf between what is really actual out there and what I understand it as. So I can't really know it as it is. So that's where this comes from. Postmodernism, which is like the philosophy of the day, the popular philosophy of the day, started in the 20th century. It came out of France, actually, which really it blossomed. And basically said that there's no such thing as truth, because everything is decided upon by me. And everybody becomes their own interpreter of what reality is. So we can't know reality as it is from Kant. And people like Jacques Derrida, he went as far as saying that, that words are meaningless. That imagine this, he writes a book about words being meaningless because the interpretation of the word is in the person who's reading it. But actually what they're depending on, that you
can understand
what he's saying, and that, are his words meaningless? That's the question that you would have to ask him. So going from, the Enlightenment, which has really, really started to pull the thread, if I could say that, on this whole understanding of truth and reality, that it really started to unwind. And we live in a day now where the truth becomes really questionable, but you don't see the impact of it until you can connect the dots and realize that once you lose the biblical sense of truth and an absolute sense of mm-hmm. truth, you lose morality. So why this is so important is because anything that we discuss in presenting evidence for the existence of God, or even the atheist writes a book based on what he believes corresponds to reality. Mm-hmm. And he expects you to look at those things believing that you understand his words correspond to reality. You're not making up meanings while you're reading the thing.
No.
You have a referent that these words are pointing to that makes sense to you, that become meaning to you.
So people tend to take the influence of Hume and Kant and then just kind of pick and choose what parts of it they want.
And in a nutshell, that once God ceased to be the center of thought and man became the center of thought, it was just rolling downhill from there. So once man becomes the arbiter of truth, that he decides what truth is, then things become meaningless. And you have a Friedrich Nietzsche who comes along and basically says life is meaningless. And then the nihilists who believe that nothing is really what reality is. There's nothingness in life, that life has no sense. And that's where you get people who want to commit suicide because now life is meaningless because
There's no point.
there's no point to it. So that's where you end up with that stuff.
I had a question, but I forgot it. So this all, again, affects our perception of reality.
Right.
And we're now looking at it. We can look out here and say, okay, here's this table, and you have what table, you can say.
Right. Yeah, it might be a table to you, but not to me.
That's
true for
right.
you, but not for me. That's an extreme example, but yeah.
Okay, now it's coming back to me here. So before you talked about Kant and agnostic. Now in our world, when somebody says agnostic or agnosticism, they're talking about they've chosen to say there's no evidence for God. I can't know God, but the word really means I can't know reality.
Yeah, can't know. Agnostic means that there is no knowledge, or if you put the letter A in front of that word Gnostic, which is Greek for knowledge, it means that there's no knowledge.
There's no knowledge.
Yes.
And so it's not just no knowledge of God, but no
Right.
knowledge.
Yeah, so you could, if someone says they're an agnostic, you could ask them what they're agnostic about.
Yeah.
Whether they're agnostic about God or everything. You can't know anything, which some people, a strong or someone that we would say is on the one end of agnosticism, a hard agnostic would say that you can't know anything. Which I don't know how you make sense of life that way when you say you can't know anything.
I have a hard time with that. I'm a very practical person, so I know I shouldn't hit anybody, but I'd want to just give them a little pop in the nose and say, did that happen?
Yeah.
Do you know that I just hit you in the nose? But I won't do that. So it affects our perception of reality, and obviously, you had some notes that you showed me that there's a rejection of transcendent reality.
Right.
And what does it mean, the rejection of essence in reality?
It's a rejection that basically says, when we talk about the nature of something or the essence of something, there's a great divide in philosophy that things have a nature, like humans have a human nature. God has a divine nature. And when we say we can't know these things or we're skeptical of these things, we reject that essence. So we're rejecting that things have an essence in themselves. We're the ones who put names on them to help us make sense of them.
That's nominalism. Is that
right? That's the word,
okay.
nominalism. Yeah.
I'm learning some new big words
Yeah.
here. I always try to do that.
And Plato would have said, that there are universals. So,
Meaning there are things that are true or
right, that they're somewhere in existence. There are these concepts that are like there's tree-ness. So that when you see a tree, you identify it as a tree because there is a universal somewhere that tells us that that's treeness, and it would deal with objects, with animals, with colors. And as a Christian, we would say that those ideas are in God, that because He's the creator, so that He's the one who creates mankind, because in Him there's the concept of humanness. So, or mankindness, I guess you could call it, but humanness sounds better. Okay. Nominalism basically says that we're the ones who label things. We put the names on things by ourselves.
And so what would be your response to someone who says, well, you really can't know anything?
I would ask them how they know that.
Okay, fair enough.
Because if they're denying that you can know anything about anything, I would ask them how they know that. In the same way we deal with things with truth. If someone says, if you turn that just a little bit and say, well, you can't know the truth, And you
How do
ask
you know
them,
that you can't know the truth?
yeah, and you would say, first of all, you could ask them, how do you know that? And then the second one was, is it true that I can't know anything?
Yeah.
So they're affirming,
Exactly.
they're
yeah.
affirming truth.
Okay. Okay. So what can we know? What do you think, or how would you articulate honest reality, an honest look at reality and truth?
Okay, there are three basic things or three choices about reality or God, and that is that I can know nothing about God or reality, which would be agnosticism. The other one, and I think some Christians hold this position, and certainly I guess it would fall in religion more than anything, and say, I know everything about reality. Or I say, I can know some things about reality, and I can know some things about God. That there are things that are partially knowable, and we call that realism.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm recognizing that these things are there, and I, for me to know everything perfectly, I would have to be God. He's the only one who knows everything perfectly. So, but I can know some things about reality, and I can know some things about God. So that becomes what we call realism. And
Okay. So.
let me go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say that unless the real world is intelligible, then you can't know anything about it.
Okay.
If existence, if reality isn't intelligible, you can never make an intelligent statement about it.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to believe that reality isn't, the real world is intelligible. You can't even think of a reality that's unthinkable. You have to,
Okay. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, I believe it's on your screen. You can send your questions in through comments, and you can also send them to questions@nopatanswers.com. We do want to hear from you, so put them in the comments today if you have an idea, a thought right now. Sometimes you get talking about this and you say, "Well, my goodness, this is confusing," but actually, the more I talk about it, the more I realize how it is very simple.
Very simple, very logical.
And it's you have to actually work hard to say, if you want to get to the place of being agnostic, and I'm kind of putting God on the side here right now. I'm
Sure.
just looking at reality, at the world around me, and to be able to say, well, that's just all an illusion, or it's just my perception of it. That to me takes a lot more mental gymnastics than saying, well, I know some things about it,
Yeah.
but I don't know everything about it.
Yeah. Yeah. My notes I have, there is a reality and we can know it. I know that I exist. And I believe you exist.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah. I know the world around me, outside of me exists. And I know that the laws of logic are true. I know that you can't have two things that make contrary truth claims and both of them be true at the same time in the same sense. Whatever isn't true is false. That makes common sense to us, and that's what makes reality livable when we understand that. If you deny that reality, then you're really a ship adrift. Mm-hmm. You don't have a compass. You really will lose meaning to life. Total skepticism ends up really defeating itself, because if you become skeptical about everything, or if you make the statement that you have to be skeptical about everything, then you've made a statement about certainty, which is a denial of skepticism. If there's something that's certain, then you can't be true there.
Skeptical about skepticism.
Exactly, and you're not agnostic about Gnosticism or agnosticism.
Let's go to that, the one you're saying, two things can't be, something can't be true and false at the same time. So I can look out the window and say it's sunny, and you say no, it's cloudy. Now, if we're looking out two different windows, it could be true.
Right, those things.
But if we're looking out the same window at the same time, both of those
seeing the same things. Yeah,
and it can't be both of those things.
Right. You can't make a statement two statements that are contrary contradict one another. That's the law of non-contradiction, which really all of logic boils down to that. That the law of non-contradiction says you can't have two things that are contrary, two statements that are contrary, and both of them be true at the same time in the same sense. Even though the postmodern world thinks that contradictions can exist, and they're happy with it. You know, which.
Well, again, that's where they pick and choose where they're going to apply. This is wrong here, right here.
Right.
And
yeah, you know, I was sharing earlier too that I had a text from a friend who sat next to a professor, someone a Yale graduate, has a doctorate in religious studies, and they got into a conversation, and my friend asked the woman, what about truth? And she said that truth is relative, first of all, and that it depends on the context. And, you know, my question would have been, and someone did ask the question to her, was, you know, is that truth out of context, you know, or in context? Yes. You know, the truth claim you've just made, is that only true in that context that you just made it, or is that true for everything? So you don't realize that you're always making absolute statements about things and about your beliefs that you believe apply to everybody, like saying truth is relative. Well, that's either an absolute statement or a relative statement. If it's relative, then it doesn't matter. Yeah. It doesn't apply. Or now you've just denied what you've just said. You've basically cut its own throat. It's self-destructive.
Okay. You had some other statements here on truth that I thought were really good, about being discovered, and I thought they were really good.
Okay, let me see if I can find you here. Yeah, truth is discovered, not invented. It exists independent of anyone's knowledge of it. You know, any of Saturn's moons that have been hiding behind the planet is there. It's true whether we believe it or not. It doesn't matter if we don't believe it. It doesn't change it. Truth is transcultural. It's true for all people in all places at all times. And it's unchanging, even though our beliefs can change, but the truth doesn't change. So, and beliefs can't change a fact. Because you believe something is true doesn't make it true. No matter how sincerely, you know, you try to believe that, and it's not affected by anyone's attitude of by the person who makes the statement, whether it's good or bad. And all truths are absolute truths. I think.
So when someone you don't like tells you you're wrong and they're right, they're still right even though you don't like them.
Exactly. Yeah.
I've had that experience.
Yeah, and you know, when we listen to people of other religious persuasions, or someone who's not part of our stream of Christian thought, doesn't mean that they cannot say true things or be right about something that we're wrong in, just because we don't like it. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So here you say that contrary beliefs are possible, but contrary truths are not. So beliefs are something that we formulate in our mind.
Yeah.
And truths are truths. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I think if I could, was it First Timothy 3:15 and 16 talk about the church is the pillar and support of truth. I'm going to get a little preachy here, but just to understand that we have let the world redefine truth and haven't stood for what we believe or how truth works. And you know, many times when I go to a church for the first time, if they've asked me to talk about apologetics or defending their faith, I'll always start with truth, because I want them to understand how I believe it's important to get this concept right. And I'll ask them if they can define truth for me. And what almost happens every time, unless they've watched some video with Ravi or Norman Geis or Frank Turek or someone like that and seen it and got the definition there, they'll always say truth is a person, you know, and they'll say Jesus is the truth. Yeah. And so then I'll ask them something like, well, you know, is 2 + 2 = Jesus? Because or the
Yeah.
color of the sky is Jesus. And there's a difference between things that are true about something and the definition of truth as we've defined it as that which corresponds to what's real. Say all of that to say this, that there's only been one time that I think I've ever gotten the right answer to that question, all the times I've asked the church that. So it tells us that the church really has abdicated that place of being a pillar and support for the truth. And once we lose that definition of truth, then what do we do with the gospel? Is the gospel only true for some people some of the time in some places, or is it true for all people all the time, every place?
In all places.
For all time. If we change that definition of truth, then we say, well, then someone could say to you, well, that's true for you, but not for me.
Exactly.
That the gospel applies to your life, but it doesn't apply to my life. And what do we understand about reality, about God and judgment and Jesus coming again and all the things that we add up in those things? So,
yeah, so that's where we take it. We take it from talking about truth and reality in just the world around us, and we take it into the realm of faith and what we believe about God. And if something that, again, I'm taking this from some of your notes, something that cannot both be true and not true at the same time in the same sense. So God exists is either true or false.
Right. Yeah. And if Christian theism, what we believe about God, is true, then everything else, or atheism at least, is false. And so it comes down to understanding that something has to be either true or false. And we live in such a PC world today that we don't want to tell anybody that that's wrong, or that's not correct, or I think I'm right in this, because then if you're right, you're arrogant. So
Like all religions, how dare you say your religion is better than another?
right.
And
So
we just saw this in the news a week or so ago with Senator Sanders grilling the Post nominee about his Christianity, and he was put on the spot and didn't, he handled himself okay, but
Right.
you had mentioned to me you would have approached that a little different.
yeah, I actually wrote a blog on it because Sanders asked him, he said, do you believe that everybody who doesn't believe Christianity is damned, going to go to hell? And the guy kind of got wishy-washy about the answer and just basically said, well, I believe that everybody deserves respect as a human being. They're all created in
all
the
good
image of
stuff,
God.
yeah.
All good. What he should have said, that he should have asked Sanders a question and said, are you asking me if I believe that Christianity is exclusive when it comes to matters of salvation and judgment? And at that point, I think Sanders would have said, yes, absolutely. And then he could have said, well, it's no more exclusive than Islam or Judaism or any other religion, because all religions are exclusive. They all have core beliefs that they understand.
Exactly.
If you don't believe that, then you're not going to get to...
Why would you be a Hindu if you didn't think Hinduism was the right way to God?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I met the Lord was I believed that if Jesus Christ was not the content of truth and he was not the true way to God, that I would have gone looking for another way, because that's what you're after in life, and that's what religion exists for.
That's right.
So,
well, that I think is one of the in fact, I was speaking to a person earlier today, and they were saying they'd like to see us maybe start working into the podcast more practical examples like this one, when you're encountered with someone who's in that case outraged at the claim that you would say that your beliefs are exclusive. We need to know how to respond in a gracious and kind way.
right.
Yes, we do think this is that, and so do you about your point of view.
Absolutely. And I think part of that is just having the right spirit, not getting argumentative. You can present an argument without being argumentative. You don't have to make somebody look stupid. You don't have to try to trap them in something, but ask them questions on how they would respond to this when someone says, well, how do you know what you believe is true? And you say, well, I think it's based on evidence. My truth has to correspond to what I believe is real. And that's the test for every worldview, is that you've got to look at the evidence for whatever that worldview is proposing. So in Christianity, we talk about the existence of God. We talk about Jesus being a real person. You know, the Bible gives us really the story from the beginning to the end. And it's a whole worldview. And can we justify our beliefs because we can see the things have happened in reality, have happened in a time-space world. And that's why we can believe those things. And anything, if the Scripture is true and Christianity is true, then anything that disagrees with the claims of Christianity has to be false.
Exactly.
And
So it all starts with the truth.
Yeah.
It all starts with an understanding of the truth.
Yeah.
Well, we're just about out of time here. Let me remind you, you can continue to send questions to questions@nopatanswers.com. And if you'd like to discuss with us having Ray come and speak at your church or with your group, you can write it to the questions or at info@nopatanswers.com. So we're really glad to have spent this time with you today, and we hope you'll join us again next week when we look at our claims about the existence of God. Thanks so much.
See you next time.